Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on the topic of attention. So before we get stuck into understanding some of the core principles of attention in normal healthy individuals, we're going to look at an example of a patient that has disorder of visual attention and awareness. So this is a video of a patient that has Blindness syndrome. Something typically occurs from damage to posterior parietal cortex and occipital cortex. That means there's only like one or a small subset of objects in the environment are ever possible to latch onto and perceive and attend to at any one time.
And grab it with that hand.
I can't tell.
Can you see it?
I can see it, but I can't tell. I can't reach it.
You seem to do better with your left hand. And take a crack at it up here, if I hold it up closer. All right, how about now that you touched it with that hand, can you reach with the other hand and grab it? With your right hand?
My right hand?
Uh-huh.
No, I can't.
If I wiggle it, does moving it help you at all?
Nah, well,
Yeah, it does a little bit. So motion sort of pulls you toward it, like. What do you see here?
a comb,
Mm-hmm. What do you see now?
comb,
What do you see now?
spoon.
Do you see the comb?
No,
Do you see the comb?
yeah.
Do you see the spoon?
Mm-hmm.
What do you see now?
I see the spoon,
What do you see now?
comb.
Do you see a spoon at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see what? Just tell me what you see.
I see what looks like a blackboard with some writing on it.
And there is a blackboard with some writing right behind us. So when you lost track of what was there, you picked up whatever was right in front of you, I guess. And you can see the writing, so it's your acuity is okay. You can see the writing.
So Blindness syndrome is really just a kind of extreme pathological instance of something that we experience on a daily basis. So for us, we are, as you're looking around the environment, we are only ever consciously aware of a really small bit of the vast amount of information that's available to our sensory systems. But by looking at patients, for example, with Blindness syndrome, we can come to learn a little bit more about what it is that the brain focuses on. So we're going to explore some examples of how we have a sort of illusion of the amount of attention that we're able to dedicate to the environment out there. And we're going to reveal some of the instances where, despite thinking we will be able to attend to and notice changes in the environment, very often we don't pick up on these. So what exactly do we mean by the term attention? A few have really kind of captured it, as well as William James in the 19th century, who claimed that everybody knows what attention is. And if I say the word to you now, it seems pretty obvious. We have a pretty clear understanding of what the concept means. He said it's taking into possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration, and consciousness are of its essence. So I think one of the key things here is this ability to selectively concentrate on one aspect of the external, or it could be an internal environment, at the expense of ignoring other distractors. So you can pay attention to something that's in the surrounding environment. You can also pay attention to internal thoughts. So you direct that attention to one single train of thought that you're having and exclude all the other sort of things that might be buzzing around in your head. So again, key thing, it's got something to do with this, focusing on one thing at the expense of withdrawing our attention from other things. Because it's usually not possible to have attention on everything. There's got to be a trade-off in where we're directing our processing resources and attention. If you look around you right now, it's very easy to believe that we constantly experience this richness of detail. So there's this kind of buzzing cacophony of different sounds, lights, there's smells, tastes, etc. Yet it's remarkable how little we notice the details of this kind of sensory input unless we explicitly direct our attention towards it. So one example would be, if you think of right now as you're sitting down watching this, is it the case that you notice the pressure of your back against the seat rest? So I'm assuming you're not sitting on a stool. And then think about which part of your back is pressed up against the chair. And then how does the fabric on your clothing feel? If you're standing up and watching this naked, maybe a good time to go and put some clothes on. But one of the things you'll notice is that as I start to mention these things, so as I start to get you to orient your attention towards the pressure of your back on the chair, you start to then experience these sensations, which up until then are not part of your perceptual experience. So in this opening part of the video, what we're going to do is explore some of the instances where we can expose the limitations of our attention. So we're going to see some examples of where we might not attend to stuff that intuitively we would expect there's no chance that we would miss that happening. Before we do, let's just try one last attention check. So the initial slide that appeared on this video, firstly, what's the title of this slide? This appeared for several seconds. What was the guy wearing on the first slide? Did he have a hat on? If yes, what colour was the hat? And did he have a scarf on? And what colour was the scarf? These are details that you've seen less than a few minutes ago that you should have probably looked at, but was it enough that you attended to this and at the level where you would remember those details? Okay. So two famous examples of failures to detect stimuli are inattentional and change blindness. So inattentional blindness refers to the failure to detect an unexpected object that appears in our visual field or visual display. Change blindness is the failure to detect an object has moved, changed, or disappeared. Now, unquestionably, one of the clearest demonstrations of inattentional blindness was conducted by Dan Simmons and Christopher Chabris. And in their study, which you should have already watched the video of this by now, they would have individuals passing a basketball around. You've got to count the number of passes. And there was a remarkable amount of individuals that would end up missing the presence of a gorilla. So to kind of deconstruct this experiment and break down some of the explanations behind it, let's listen to a short video interviewing Dan Simmons on the invisible gorilla effect.
I'm Dan Simons. I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Illinois, and I also have an appointment at the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology. My research here focuses on visual cognition, what we see, what we don't see, how much of our visual world we're aware of, how much we remember from one moment to the next. One of my best known studies was done with my collaborator Chris Chabris some years ago, and it was based on some much earlier work by our colleague Dick Neisser. And what we had was a video in which people were passing basketballs. So 3 people were wearing white shirts and they were passing a ball, and your task when you were watching the video was just to count how many times those 3 players passed the ball. We also had 3 players wearing black shirts passing their own ball, and you were supposed to ignore their passes. So as you're doing this task, after about 30 seconds, say, we'd have a person wearing a full-body gorilla suit walk into the middle of the scene, stop in the center, turn and face the camera, thump its chest, and then walk off the other side a total of about 9 seconds later. And what we find is that about half the people who do this simply don't notice the gorilla.
When Dan asked me to be a part of this experiment, I thought, no way, people are totally going to see me. I'm a 400-pound gorilla.
We'll ask them afterwards, how many passes did you count, which they generally get pretty close to right. We then ask them, did you notice anything unusual? Did you notice anything other than the players? Did you notice anything walk through the scene? And they'll say no. So we ask them, did you notice a gorilla? And the response is typically, a what?
So then the Simons guy says, you know, we can show you and not everyone's going to see you? Yeah, right. How can people not see me? I'm huge. I'm ferocious. I'm a 400-pound gorilla. What was he thinking?
And we rewind the tape and show it to them again, and the reaction is typically, I missed that? It's shocking that you could possibly miss something as obvious as a gorilla. Of course, the people who noticed the gorilla are shocked that anybody could possibly have missed it, because it's right there in front of you.
I walk in there, I walk in the middle, all these kids are running around throwing this ball around, I stand there, I thump my chest. Not once, not twice, 3 times I thump my chest. That's scary, man. What else are people gonna look at? You know, I'm big, I'm a gorilla, and they don't see me. What's up with that?
This is the intuition we have, that if something important or distinctive or unusual, like a person in a gorilla suit, walks into our field of view, we'll automatically notice it. The reality is that only about half the people do. About 90% think they will.
People are just so focused on counting those passes that they don't notice me. You know, I'm not trying to be subtle here.
Even more remarkable, my colleague Daniel Memmert used the gorilla video in a study in which he had people wearing an eye tracker. And what that does is tells you exactly where they're looking as they're watching this video and counting the passes by the team wearing white. And what he found was that the people who missed the gorilla looked at it for up to a second. So they looked right at it, but still didn't see it. Looking isn't the same as seeing. We have to focus attention on something in order to become aware of it.
How do you think it makes me feel? You know, I'm trying to be intimidating. It makes me feel inadequate.
The most consistent question we get is, are there some people who consistently notice the gorilla and other people who don't? So are there noticers and missers among us? And the reality seems to be no, that it's largely just a matter of a flip of the coin. We know when we've noticed something unexpected, but we're not aware of the times when we've missed something unexpected. The failure to notice people in gorilla suits is really a natural byproduct of something that we do quite well and that's very important to us, which is focusing our attention. We need to be able to filter out the distractions from our world and not let them interfere with our ability to do the task we're trying to do. The key is that when you're focusing your attention on one aspect of your world, you don't have an unlimited amount of attention to devote to other things. And we only see those things that we focus our attention on. The problem is that on occasion we filter something that we might want to notice, and we don't realize that we're doing that. That sort of mismatch between what we see and what we think we see is a really profound one that has all sorts of consequences for our daily lives.
So the examples of using a gorilla walking across a visual scene of people playing basketball, that all seems a little bit abstract. It's not something that we're likely to encounter on a daily basis. So what about the applied implications of this? Is it something that would really matter and affects all of us? So some research looks at how this might be important in domains such as medical research. So let's take a look.
Dr. Trafton Drew and research colleagues from the Visual Attention Lab at Harvard Medical School decided to examine if inattentional blindness also exists in the eyes of trained experts, such as radiologists. In a recent study published in Psychological Science, Dr. Drew asked 24 radiologists to search for signs of lung cancer in 239 frames of a chest CT scan. In this stack of images, he inserted 5 consecutive frames containing an image of a gorilla. Despite superior ability of radiologists to detect lung cancer nodules, 20 of the 24 radiologists did not report noticing the gorilla. Interestingly, eye tracking revealed that most of the radiologists who missed noticing the gorilla had looked directly at it. Looking right at something might not be enough to notice that it's there if you're looking for something else. This study suggests that even experts who routinely detect cancer nodules, which are about 48 times smaller than the image of the gorilla, are also susceptible to limitations of attention. By understanding these limitations, future research may help reduce errors committed by experts in diagnostic radiology, baggage screening, and many other professions that involve searching for items that are difficult to find.
So the evidence that we've just seen suggests that maybe inattentional blindness is something that is very relevant within medicine and particularly for radiologists. However, if we put a kind of cynical hat on, we might come up with the argument that, again, all you're doing in those cases is putting a gorilla onto these scans. And is that really something that, as an expert radiologist, it would be kind of nice if they did ignore something as ridiculous as that. You don't want them paying attention to this. And one of the benefits of being an expert is you are going to detect just like clinically relevant disorders that are there. So if there's a kind of a cancerous tumour you're going to pick that up, but yeah, a gorilla, it's not something I trained for. It makes sense that I miss this. So some research that was published in 2020 that I think addresses this issue quite nicely. They presented radiologists with a CT scan here, and their instructions of the task was to perform what's known as a lung nodule screening task. So we've got a sample of expert radiologists and then trainees that are doing this task. So again, the focus is meant to be on detecting these lung nodules. So anything greater than 3 millimeters, you've got to click on and identify. And then they threw in, after doing several of these trials, the very final trial would also include something that indicates a pathology of the lymph nodes within the breast here. And this is something, as a radiologist, that you're doing this. If you're looking at one of these CT scans, that should surely jump out at you, that you would notice that pretty obviously. So they wanted to look, what was the detection rate of these radiologists? How often did they pick it up? So they asked them at the end of doing the final one, did you notice any other medically relevant findings on this case? Did the final case show signs of breast cancer? The final case show signs of these lymph lung nodules. And you see pretty clear effects here, regardless of the level of expertise. So you've got the trainees in grey, the practicing expert physicians in pink. They both seem very good at detecting the lung nodules that they were asked to detect. Probably not as good as you would like it to be, but their detection rate is sort of over 60-70% on there. But then a marked drop-off for their detection of the breast mass. So we've got less than 40% of the time that they're detecting this. So that's a pretty genuine example of in sort of applied settings where when your focus is on one element, so your task is maybe to focus on just these lung nodules, how you might easily miss something else that's very obvious. And you can think of examples where that would happen, where senior staff are maybe suggesting that this is the most common cause that we've got to look for. And yeah, you quite easily miss something that you shouldn't have done. Okay, so changed blindness is the failure to detect that an object has moved, changed, or disappeared. In the introductory lecture, we've already seen an example of the advert for Alfa Romeo, that multiple things would change in the visual scene, yet often we don't detect many of those changes, if any of them. But if something's changing right in front of your eye, surely you would pick up on this quite easily. So if I give you one scene, there is one single thing that's changing in the presentation of that image just there. See if you can pick out what it is. Okay, so if you haven't already detected it, the reason it's changing is just in the very center of the image here. So the background behind the present here is changing from a light to a dark shade. And then we'll do one final example here. Okay, if I reveal this, if you look at the Mercedes on the right hand side, the shading of the back windscreen is changing across each of those presentations. So what exactly is going on with changed blindness, and especially in the flickered task paradigm? What is it that stops us from noticing what are ostensibly very obvious changes? And the key factor here is believed to be the appearance of these blank fields, so the grey mask that appears in between the images. Now normally a change would produce a motion signal at its locations, and we can and do notice and detect changes even if they occur in our periphery. So if you imagine that you're sitting in a room and you see a light that blinks in the corner of your eye, you notice it, your attention is drawn there. There's a mosquito that flies past in the corner. You notice it moving and your attention is drawn there. So we're pretty good at detecting these changes because we have local motion detectors in the visual cortex. So again, there's individual cells that will respond to motion detection, and from a very sort of bottom-up driven way, they will draw our attention towards motion. And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense, that we are attuned to pick up and notice things that are moving around us. Now, in the flicker task paradigm, we basically have the grey screen mask essentially sort of swamps these local motion signals. So in other words, if you imagine that our visual sensory system can normally store an entire representation of the scene that you're looking at, and we would automatically detect any changes to it, so any motion that occurs. That presentation then of the grey mask basically wipes the slate clean of that current stored representation that we have. And then after that blank screen, when we're then presented the new modified image, we just can't detect any change because we don't have that original visual scene to compare it against. So there's no real motion to notice or detect between here. So instead what we end up doing is having to try and explicitly direct our attention around this visual scene until we hone in and notice the specific region that is changing. So in this example here, we've got a aeroplane that has a single change that's occurring to the image. One of the things you can do is look at what happens if we take away. So in this case, we have the visual mask that's being presented, and if you're looking at this image, for most people it takes you a relatively long amount of time until your attention hones in on this. What happens if we take away that grey screen in between? So if I just flick in between two presentations of the image without the visual mask, for all of you, you should pretty quickly notice that the thing that is there or wasn't there is the big engine on this aeroplane here. There's also some conditions where we're more or less likely to experience change blindness. The first one, these typically studied using paradigms such as the flicker task, shows that when you make changes to objects that are central, so either their orientation on the visual field is towards the center, or that they're focal in terms of they have importance within that visual scene. So in that previous example, the engine was both a central component or a part of the object that you're looking at, but it was also positioned relatively central to the screen. So we're typically much more likely to detect these things that are the more centrally located. We're also much more likely to detect things when we're expecting a change. So 90% of people detect changes when they're told in advance, but this drops down dramatically. Now, when you're uninformed and you don't know that a change is occurring, we tend to be really poor at detecting changes. So you can see this in real-life examples would be films that you watch where there's an inconsistency between two scenes. So they might show you a backdrop, flick away to another camera angle, and then come back to that scene you're just looking at less than a second before, and something pretty substantial could have changed, but you're not going to notice it, especially if you haven't been told that there's a scene change here. And finally, and probably most obviously, we end up detecting changes when our explicit over attention is just directed towards that region where the change is occurring.